I grew up in the South, and I grew up in a culture, now I can look back and see it was very repressive. It was very hard to be in touch with the kind of feelings that I was having and the kind of thoughts I was having, experiences I was having, and to be able to relate to other people with those. Just the kind of attitudes and values I had in the world, and not having those synced up, I had to bury those, and I essentially had to learn how not to be in touch with those because it was too painful. It was too painful, there was too much risk to be that kind of person. I could be hurt if I was that person in the kind of environments I grew up. Over time, I think that sort of dislocation from myself just became too much. And I ended up wanting to die. But then I would come out of that and I would suddenly have a lot more energy and I would feel like I was back in the world. And when I would feel back in the world, I would just be like, oh my God, I hope I never go through that again. And I, it'd be really creative, and that would be it would be exhilarating. I think what ended up happening though was after going through a number of those spells, I started to really be scared about going through them again. And I decided to go see a psychiatrist. And then I started to unveil my story. He said, so Stephen, what brings you here today? And I said, well, let me tell you what brings me here today. And I said, when I was 12 and blah, blah, blah. And I started going through it. And about 5 minutes into it, he kind of shunned me off. And he got right to the assessment, how are you sleeping? Do you have racing thoughts? And I guess that was the first experience that I had where my story became irrelevant. And I was, diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and medications followed. So I was told that this was a chemical imbalance in my brain, and that it would be something I would contend with for the rest of my life. And over the next year, I had several other hospitalizations. I took on this identity that, I'm chronically mentally ill. It was reinforced by all the literature I read, it was reinforced by the movies I saw, it was reinforced by everything. And I was scared to ever have the kind of experiences again. And so I saw myself as a diagnosis, and I started to act as if. I started to act as if I was ill, and as if I was going to be ill for the rest of my life. So I had sort of, other hospitalizations, green meds, red meds, blue meds, yellow meds, white meds, this med, that med doesn't work, let's try this med. Taking 5 medications at a time, taking 3 medications at a time, this kind of thing. I felt tortured. I mean, that's the best way to say it. I was reading those hospital notes recently, and Stephen's curled up in the ball and was paranoid that people were watching him. People were watching me, and I was curled up in the ball, and I got no help. And they released me, and I was actually in a lot worse shape than I was in before I got in there. And to survive for months, I would take sleeping pills during the daytime, and just to try and just conk out, because I couldn't just handle the pain that I was in. I ended up seeing a therapist, and we started doing a lot of dream analysis. We started paying attention to things that had been neglected in the illness framework, but it also been neglected from my cultural upbringing. And there was a lot of pain. There was a lot of pain that came up, and a lot of stuff to navigate. And I think what happened is my voice started to kind of come out of here. And then I moved to Vermont, and I met some radicals. And I met people that were diagnosed with schizophrenia or had been in the system for years, and they were living good lives, and they were seeing themselves as people, and most importantly, they had a story, and they believed that their story was explained who they were and was important to tell. I started to release myself from the single kind of minded explanation that my brain was dictating my experiences, which is very much caught up with our current sort of rationalist, neuroscience obsessed culture that's sort of promoting this idea that brain equals consciousness equals a person. But I started to kind of get out of that a little bit. And so I'd mentioned, I met these radicals in Vermont and people that were really doing different things. And so I met somebody one day who said that they had been diagnosed with the same things I had been diagnosed, and they were no longer taking psychiatric drugs. And this was the first real time that I had met someone in person who articulated that experience. It had been years that I've been in the system, that I had been taking psychiatric drugs, that I had all kinds of conversations with people, thousands of people, because I had been working in peer support, all this stuff. This is the first time that I met someone who said that, which is amazing to me, because now I meet people that say that all the time. But for some reason or not for some reason, because that voice has been so oppressed and is so devalued by the traditional medical narrative, that it's not prevalent, and it can be hard to find. And I met him, and he told me that, and I said, you know what, if he can do it, I can do it. And because I didn't want to take the meds, I was tired of taking them. I was tired of paying for them. I was tired of the effects that they gave me. I was tired of the nosebleeds, the head rushes, the fatigue. Well, at that time I was taking 5 meds. I was taking Effexor, Wellbutrin, Lamictal, Tegretol, and Trazodone. And I meditated, and I did my, I was into nature. I was still into nature. I would go on my hikes, and I took it seriously. Like, I knew that there was risk involved, and I really didn't want to end up overwhelmed again. But I got off all the drugs, and I noticed something. That not only as my voice was coming back, all of a sudden I felt sharper, and music sounded more musical again. And the wind in the forest looked, it spoke to me again. And with all of that, I felt more intensely. I felt rage and kind of grief, but I also felt more alive. And I said, well, wait a second, I feel better. And after a few months after I had completely come off, I was like, I don't think I'm going to end up back in the hospital again. So what the hell happened to my mental illness? And so I did something that I hadn't done before. I said, well, what is it, where do these people that talk about mental illness get their information from? And I learned that they were supposed to get it from scientific journals. And so I lived near Dartmouth College, and so I started sneaking into Dartmouth College, and I looked like a student, so I acted like I was a student. I would go on their computers where I had free journal access, and I'd take a USB drive in there, and I'd download as many journal articles as I could at once, and I collected 1,000 articles. And I would go home, and I would read, and I'd read, and I read all of their stuff. And honestly, I was expecting to find a lot of evidence that would support the medical model version of mental illness. What I ended up encountering was that not only was there not evidence to support all the messages I've been given, the evidence of genes was faulty, the evidence of chemical imbalances was certainly faulty. All that stuff was problematic. They didn't control for whether people were taking drugs when they did the brain scans, or they had too small of a sample, like 10 people, or the same changes they saw in the brains with people diagnosed with schizophrenia, they would also see in people not diagnosed with schizophrenia, or it only happened in 10% of people diagnosed with this, and it was like, wait a second. And so I started to be in shock about, oh my God, these messages that, by the way, I had been promoting to people in peer support, because I believed them, because I've been told them. I've been telling other people they had chemical imbalances in their brain, and I'm sorry to all those people. But I started to realize that, there was this whole kind of, it wasn't supported, and not only wasn't it supported, but most of these studies were funded by the pharmaceutical industry, who would stand to profit from the theories that they were trying to piece together that weren't even supported by the evidence. So it was this kind of wild scenario. And congruently with that, I was also finding that there was these alternative things like a Soteria House, and later I'd come across open dialogue stuff. And, the Martin Harrow studies, the World Health Organization studies, Courtney Harding studies with the Vermont State Hospital and how people did over the long term. And you'd start to see that, wait, people get better, and that places where less drugs were used, people were getting better. And if it was a brain problem, and if this was a hopeless chemical imbalance, how was it that some people were getting better? And meanwhile, there was all these narratives that people were saying that they actually found use in some of the, or value in some of the experience. The diabasis stuff and John Weir Perry, and of people, being weller than well after going through a really torrential experience. And then I came across all of this stuff on trauma. that almost everyone that gets diagnosed with these major mental illnesses has significant trauma in their lives. And that started to shine a light into my own past and started to get me more in touch with my story and say, well, wait a second, you know, the things that happened to me, you know, they shaped who I was. And that was difficult too as a man, and with gender issues and gender issues. I mean, I don't want to frame it that way, but growing up in the South as a male, you know, you don't talk about those things. You pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you know, stop being sensitive, all those kinds of things. And so you learn to really just ignore that whole sense of any of those kinds of emotional violations or physical violations. I mean, what's physical abuse in my culture, I saw sometimes as just, you know, the legitimate punishment for doing wrong, you know, those kinds of things. And so I started to, you know, with that trauma lens, I could start to reframe things and start to look at things differently. So I going off my meds, I discovered all this literature, I discovered this new framework, and I got pissed. I said, oh my God, you know, I got to go talk to people about this. We got to have a conversation about this. And at the same time, I applied to go to this holotropic breathwork thing with Stanislav Grof and Jack Kornfield. They were, you know, Stanislav Grof wrote about spiritual emergency, and I thought that I really jived with what they were saying, that maybe my experience was a spiritual kind of awakening. And I got a scholarship to go to it. And then they asked me for my medical history. And I told them that, you know, I had been in hospitals and stuff, but I was fine now. I was working and all that kind of stuff to prove to them I was fine. And they took away my scholarship because they were worried that I was mentally ill. And so this was just like taking a bucket of fuel and dumping it on my fire. And so that kind of got me into the world of advocacy. And I guess I always came from a perspective of dialogue. I wanted to have dialogue in a manner of respect that I also wanted people to treat me with. Where the story goes from there is that, you know, I got involved in I got very involved in trying to create alternative spaces, or spaces for people who were having difficult experiences to go to, where we wouldn't be diagnosed, where we wouldn't be treated as animals, where we wouldn't be, where our stories would be valued and heard and become part of the tapestry of a community. And so I got involved working at a place we called a community center for psychiatric survivors, and got involved in setting up peer-run respites and working on the Soteria Vermont project, because it became clear to me that we need to have in our communities places where people can go that are going to treat people as people. The mental health is really not just mental health, it's environmental health, it's physical health, it's societal health, it's community health, it's all of these different systems come together we're products of all of this different kind of stuff. And we can't just isolate it. We have to start having conversations about, you know, is our economic system really producing health? The way that we're just completely destroying the planet, you know, is that something we can do and still thrive as a species? Our prison system, and the way that we just cut people off from the world, stick them in cages, and then expect them to rehabilitate, is that something that we can do and still have healthy communities? These are rhetorical questions. My answer is, you know, no, and that we have to start rethinking all of those structures. That's what inspires me.